The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Corporal Elena Vasquez ran her cleaning rod through the barrel of another M24 sniper rifle. Oil and metal shavings collected in the small tin beside her workbench, the same routine she had followed for 18 months since her transfer to the Armory. The weapon felt familiar in her hands, though none of the soldiers who collected their rifles ever bothered to notice how carefully she handled each piece. Heavy boots echoed against the concrete floor as Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane pushed through the Armory door, followed by 3 other members of the elite sniper team. Kane barely glanced in her direction as he approached the counter, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being the best marksman on base. "Need my rifle cleaned and zeroed for tomorrow's qualification," he announced, dropping his weapon case onto the metal surface. Elena looked up from her work, studying the man who held the current base record for longest confirmed kill at 2,100 meters. Kane's reputation preceded him everywhere he went, and he made sure everyone knew it. "Of course, Sergeant," Elena replied quietly, setting down her current project. She opened his case and carefully lifted out the custom-modified rifle, her fingers automatically checking the scope mounts and trigger mechanism. The weapon showed signs of excellent maintenance, though she noticed several adjustments that could improve its precision at extreme range. Kane watched her handle his rifle with obvious skepticism, as if doubting whether someone like her could properly care for a precision instrument. Kane leaned against the counter, his team members spreading out behind him as they waited. Sergeant First Class Derek Mills picked up a scope from Elena's workbench, turning it over in his hands like he was examining a toy. "Hope you know what you're doing with this equipment, Tech," he said with a smirk. "These aren't your standard issue carbines." Elena continued her inspection of Kane's rifle, noting the custom barrel work and precision stock modifications. The weapon was impressive, though she could see room for improvement in the cheek rest alignment. She had worked on far more sophisticated systems during her previous assignment, but that information remained buried in classified files. "You ever actually fire one of these, or just clean them?" Mills asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Elena glanced up briefly, meeting his condescending stare before returning to her work. She had learned long ago that revealing too much about her background only led to complications and unwanted attention from command. Kane chuckled, shaking his head as he watched her careful movements. "Look at her trying to figure out how it works," he said to his teammates. "Probably thinks the scope is the dangerous end." The group erupted in laughter, their voices echoing off the armory walls. Elena tightened her grip on a rifle, fighting the urge to demonstrate exactly how well she understood the weapon's capabilities. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, methodically checking each component while the snipers continued their commentary. "Tomorrow's qualification would be interesting," Kane mentioned casually. "We're pushing the limits at 3,800 meters. Elena's hands remained steady as she continued working on Kane's rifle, though her jaw tightened slightly at the mention of the extreme distance shot. 3,800 meters was beyond what most military snipers attempted, even under ideal conditions. The ballistic calculations alone required expertise that few possessed, accounting for wind drift, bullet drop, and atmosphere pressure distances where a single degree of error meant missing by yards. Mills noticed a reaction and grinned, nudging Kane's shoulder. "Hey Marcus, I bet our little armorer here thinks she could make that shot." The suggestion sent another wave of laughter through the group, with specialist Jake Torres adding his own commentary about how Elena probably couldn't hit a target at 300 meters, let alone 3,800. Kane's eyes lit up with cruel amusement as he considered the possibility. "That's actually not a bad idea," he said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "What do you say, Tech? Think you've got what it takes to play with the big boys?" Elena looked up from the rifle, meeting his challenging stare directly for the first time since he had entered the armory. The room fell silent as the other soldiers waited for her response. Elena knew that accepting such a challenge would draw attention she had spent months avoiding, but something in Kane's arrogant expression made her reconsider her usual policy of staying invisible. "I've made longer shots before," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough confidence to make Kane raise an eyebrow. Kane's expression shifted from amusement to surprise at Elena's calm assertion. Mills and Torres exchanged glances, uncertain whether the quiet armorer was serious or simply trying to save face. The tension in the room grew thicker as Kane processed her words, his competitive nature clearly triggered by the unexpected challenge to his expertise. Longer shots, Kane repeated slowly, his tone becoming more serious. Where exactly would that be, Corporal? Elena returned her attention to his rifle, carefully adjusting the scope mount while considering how much to reveal. Her previous assignment had required shots at distances that remained classified, but the specific details were less important than the skills she had developed. That's need-to-know information, Sergeant, she replied evenly, using the standard military phrase for classified operations. Kane's eyes narrowed as he studied her more carefully, perhaps noticing for the first time the quiet confidence in her movements and the way she handled his precision weapon like someone intimately familiar with its capabilities. Torres stepped forward, his voice carrying a mix of skepticism and curiosity. You're telling us you've actually made shots beyond 3,800 meters? Elena finished her inspection and set Kane's rifle carefully in its case, meeting Torres's challenging stare without flinching. The ballistics become significantly more complex beyond 4,000 meters, she said matter-of-factly. Wind drift calculations require atmospheric modeling that most spotters haven't trained for. The technical accuracy of her statement caught all three snipers off guard, their mocking expressions replaced by genuine surprise and growing interest in this armorer who spoke their language. Kane straightened up, his competitive instincts fully engaged as he processed Elena's technical knowledge. The casual dismissal he had shown earlier evaporated, replaced by the focused attention of a professional marksman recognizing potential competition. Mills and Torres remained silent, waiting to see how their team leader would respond to this unexpected development. All right then, Armorer, Kane said, his voice taking on a formal challenge tone. Tomorrow morning, range 7. 3,800 meters, standard military target. You miss, and you admit in front of everyone that you were just talking tough. Elena nodded calmly, showing none of the nervousness that would be expected from someone facing such an extreme test of marksmanship. And when I make the shot, she asked quietly, her steady gaze never leaving Kane's face. The question caught him off guard, as he had clearly expected her to focus on the consequences of failure rather than success. Kane's jaw tightened as he considered what stakes would be appropriate for such an unlikely scenario. When you miss, he corrected firmly, but Elena's unwavering confidence was beginning to unnerve him. If by some miracle you actually connect at that distance, I'll personally recommend you for sniper school. The offer was generous, though Kane clearly believed he would never have to follow through on such a promise. Torres whistled softly at the stakes, while Mills shook his head in disbelief. Elena simply nodded her acceptance, returning to her work as if the conversation had been about routine maintenance schedules rather than an impossible shooting challenge that would determine her reputation on base. Word of the challenge spread through the base like wildfire. By evening chow, half the battalion had heard about the Armory tech who claimed she could outshoot the legendary Marcus Kane at an impossible distance. Soldiers gathered in small groups, debating the odds and placing informal wagers on the outcome. Most considered it a foregone conclusion, with Elena facing certain humiliation. Master Sergeant Rita Chan approached Elena's workbench just before closing time, her weathered face showing a mixture of concern and curiosity. Heard about tomorrow's show, Vasquez, she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. You sure you know what you're getting into? Kane's got a reputation for crushing people who challenge him. Elena looked up from the rifle she was reassembling, meeting Chin's worried gaze with calm determination. Sometimes reputations need adjusting, Sergeant, she replied simply. Chin studied her for a long moment, noting something in Elena's demeanor that suggested more depth than her quiet armorer persona revealed. Private Tommy Brooks appeared in the doorway, his young face bright with excitement. Corporal Vasquez, is it true? Are you really going to take on Kane at 3,800 meters? His enthusiasm was infectious, though Elena could see the doubt lurking behind his hopeful expression. Elena set down her tools and faced the growing crowd of curious soldiers who had gathered outside the armory. Their faces showed a mixture of skepticism, anticipation, and hope that someone might finally challenge the arrogant sniper team's dominance on base. The following morning arrived with clear skies and minimal wind, conditions that would normally favor long-range shooting. Elena arrived at range 7:30 minutes early, carrying a worn rifle case that looked unremarkable compared to the custom equipment the sniper teams typically used. She had spent the previous evening selecting her weapon carefully, choosing familiarity over flash. Kane and his team were already present, along with what seemed like half the base personnel who had found excuses to be in the area. Master Sergeant Shin stood near the firing line with a spotting scope, while Colonel James Hartwell observed from a respectful distance. The presence of the base commander added unexpected gravity to what many had assumed would be a routine humiliation. Elena opened her case and withdrew a standard issue M24, the same model she had been cleaning the previous day. The weapon showed signs of extensive use but meticulous maintenance, its worn finish telling stories of countless hours of practice and precision work. Kane raised an eyebrow at her choice, clearly expecting something more exotic for such an ambitious attempt. "That's your secret weapon?" he asked mockingly, though his voice carried less confidence than it had the day before. Elena began her pre-shot routine with methodical precision, checking every component and adjustment with the careful attention of someone who understood that at extreme range, tiny details determined success or failure. The crowd grew silent as she settled into position, her movements displaying a professional competence that surprised many of the watching soldiers who had only known her as the quiet armorer. Elena adjusted her scope with micro-precision movements, her fingers working the turrets with a muscle memory of someone who had performed these calculations countless times before. She pulled out a small notebook and began recording atmospheric data, noting temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure with scientific accuracy that impressed even Kane's experienced team. The target stood barely visible at 3,800 meters, a distant speck that challenged even the powerful spotting scopes. Most soldiers in the crowd could barely make out the target frame, let alone the scoring rings that would determine success or failure. Elena studied the mirage patterns through her scope, reading the invisible air currents that would affect her bullet's flight path. Kane moved closer, his earlier mockery replaced by professional curiosity as he watched Elena's preparation routine. Her movements were too precise, too confident for someone attempting an impossible shot on a whim. Mills whispered something to Torres, both men now paying serious attention to the armorer they had dismissed so easily. Elena made final adjustments to her cheek weld and breathing pattern, settling into the shooting position with practiced ease. The crowd held its collective breath as she began her final preparation sequence, her body language radiating the calm focus of someone entering a familiar zone of concentration. Colonel Hartwell stepped forward slightly, his experienced eye recognizing something in Elena's demeanor that suggested this challenge might not end as everyone expected. The morning air grew still as Elena prepared to attempt what many considered an impossible feat of marksmanship. Elena's breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm every precision shooter knew by heart. Her finger found the trigger with gentle contact, applying pressure with the patience of someone who understood that rushing at this distance meant certain failure. The rifle became an extension of her body as she entered the final phase of her shot sequence. Kane positioned himself behind a spotting scope, his professional pride now fully engaged despite his earlier dismissive attitude. He had never attempted a shot at this extreme distance himself, and watching Elena's methodical approach was beginning to make him question his assumptions about her capabilities. Master Sergeant Chun called for silence as Elena reached the point of no return in her breathing cycle. The assembled crowd seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their casual chatter dying away completely. Even Private Brooks stopped fidgeting, his young face intense with concentration as he watched the armorer he had defended prepare for a moment of truth. Elena's world narrowed to the crosshairs, the distant target, and the microscopic movements required to align them perfectly. Years of classified training surfaced in her muscle memory, techniques learned in situations far more demanding than a base shooting challenge. Her finger began the final trigger press with surgical precision. The silence stretched across the range like a held breath, with dozens of soldiers waiting to witness either an impossible victory or spectacular failure. Elena's reputation, her future on the base, and Kane's arrogant confidence all balanced on the edge of a single trigger pull. The rifle cracked with a sharp report that echoed across the range, breaking the tense silence that had enveloped the crowd. Elena maintained her position, following through with textbook precision as the bullet began its long journey toward the distant target. The flight time at 3,800 meters would be nearly 4 seconds, an eternity for everyone waiting to see the result. Kane pressed his eye to the spotting scope, tracking the bullet's path through the shimmering air. His expression changed from skeptical anticipation to growing amazement as he watched the projectile maintain its trajectory with mathematical precision. Mills and Torres crowded behind him, trying to get their own view of what was happening downrange. The seconds stretched like hours as the bullet covered the impossible distance. Elena remained motionless in her shooting position, her breathing controlled and steady while everyone around her held their breath in anticipation. Master Sergeant Chun adjusted her spotting scope, trying to get a clear view of the target area through the heat mirage. Then Kane's voice cut through the silence with a tone of pure disbelief. "Holy hell," he whispered, his eyes still pressed to the scope. "Dead center. Perfect 10 ring." The words seemed to hang in the air as the crowd processed what they had just witnessed. Private Brooks let out a whoop of celebration, while other soldiers stood in stunned silence. Elena finally rose from her shooting position, her calm demeanor unchanged despite having just accomplished what most considered impossible. She began breaking down her rifle with the same methodical precision she had used to prepare for the shot. Colonel Hartwell stepped forward, his weathered face showing recognition rather than surprise. He had been studying Elena throughout the demonstration, and pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. "Corporal Vasquez," he said formally, "I believe we need to have a conversation about your previous assignment." His tone carried the authority of someone who had access to classified personnel files. Kane stood frozen beside his spotting scope, his worldview fundamentally shaken by what he had just witnessed. The quiet armorer he had dismissed and mocked had just executed a shot that he himself had never attempted, doing it with a precision that spoke of extensive specialized training. Mills and Torres exchanged bewildered looks, realizing they had completely misjudged the woman they had been harassing. Elena finished securing her rifle and faced the assembled crowd with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the ordeal. The shot wasn't luck, and everyone present now understood that fact. Her calm acceptance of their amazement suggested that 3,800 meters was well within her normal capabilities, not at the extreme edge of possibility. Master Sergeant Chen approached with obvious respect, extending her hand in congratulation. "Outstanding shooting, Corporal," she said firmly. Elena shook her hand briefly before turning back to Kane, who was still struggling to process what had just occurred. The arrogant confidence he had displayed the previous day had evaporated completely, replaced by something approaching humility. Private Brooks pushed through the crowd, his face glowing with vindication and excitement. He had believed in Elena when no one else would, and her success felt like a personal victory for the young soldier who had supported her. Kane approached Elena with visible effort, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine respect and curiosity. "I owe you an apology, Corporal," he said quietly, extending his hand, "and apparently a recommendation for sniper school, though I suspect you've already graduated from programs I've never heard of." Elena accepted his handshake with a slight nod, her expression softening for the first time since the challenge began. Colonel Hartwell cleared his throat, addressing the dispersing crowd with military authority. "What you witnessed here today remains on base," he announced firmly. "Corporal Vasquez has demonstrated exceptional marksmanship that reflects well on this entire unit." The message was clear. Elena's display would be celebrated, not scrutinized for security implications. The crowd began to break up, soldiers heading back to their duties with animated discussions about what they had seen. Private Brooks lingered near Elena, his admiration obvious as he helped her pack her equipment. Master Sergeant Chun made notes in her logbook, officially recording the remarkable achievement for base records. Kane's team gathered their gear in subdued silence, their previous mockery replaced by professional respect for someone who had clearly operated at levels they were still aspiring to reach. Mills approached Elena hesitantly, offering his assistance with her equipment case as a gesture of newfound respect. As the range cleared and normal base activities resumed, Elena returned to her quiet role in the armory, but the dynamic had changed permanently. Word of her extraordinary skill would spread, earning her the recognition and respect that her classified service record had never allowed her to claim publicly. If you enjoyed this story of hidden military precision, drop a comment about your favorite moment, or share if you've ever seen someone surprise everyone with their unexpected skills.